You know, after 40 years on this bench, I thought I had seen everything. But on the morning of March 15th, I watched a man walk into my courtroom with his shoulders already defeated. I listened to one sentence from him, and I felt something in my chest tighten. I still can't believe what I learned before that morning ended. And when I finally spoke my ruling, I watched strangers in my courtroom look at each other like they had just witnessed a miracle. I want to tell you exactly what happened that day because I saw fear turn into hope right in front of me. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence for 40 years, and I still wake up like I'm new at it. I still put my feet on the floor, and I feel the same responsibility settle on my shoulders. I still look in the mirror, and I remind myself that every person I see today is somebody's child. I still button my shirt slowly because I know I'm going to be asked to make decisions that stick to people for years. I've had my morning coffee the same way for 40 years. I like it strong. I like it black. I like it hot enough that it makes me slow down for a second. I always say that coffee doesn't just wake me up, it warns me. I feel that first bitter sip, and I remember that the day is going to bring me some bitter stories too. I've been married to my wife for 48 years, and I swear she can read my face before I even speak. I can walk into the kitchen, and I can try to act normal, and I can see her eyes narrow just a little. I can hear her say, "I can tell you had a day yesterday," and I can't hide from her. I can't hide from her because she's seen me come home after victories, and I've seen her watch me come home after heartbreak. I grew up in Providence, and I learned early that your name matters. I learned that people might not remember every word you said, but I learned they remember how you made them feel. I learned that when you carry a title, you don't carry it for yourself. I learned you carry it for the people who don't have one. My father immigrated from Italy with nothing but hope and a work ethic, and I still hear his voice when I sit on that bench. I can still picture his hands, rough and cracked from labor, wrapping around a coffee cup like it was a trophy. I can still hear him tell me, "Frank, you can lose money and get it back." I can't say the same about respect. I can still hear him tell me, "Frank, a man's character is what he does when nobody is watching, but a judge has to watch anyway." I learned early in my career that the courtroom isn't just a place where I apply laws. I learned it's a place where I have to read people. I learned it's a place where I have to listen for what they're not saying. I learned it's a place where I have to remember that behind every ticket, every fine, every charge, I'm staring at a life that's already complicated. Every morning I get to the courthouse at 8:15. I've been doing it since 1984, and I can almost do it with my eyes closed. I can feel the same hallway air hit my face. I can hear the same echo of shoes. I can see the same guards nod at me like we're all part of a routine that keeps the world from slipping off its tracks. I've had clerks come and go, but I've been blessed to have people around me who treat the job like it matters. I've always believed that if the people around me treat it like it's sacred, I'll treat it like it's sacred too. I've always believed that the tone I set becomes the tone the room accepts. That particular morning, I remember everything with a strange clarity. I remember the weather because I felt it in my bones when I stepped out of my car. I remember I had that little ache in my knee that reminds me I'm not 30 anymore. I remember I held my coat tighter and I told myself, Frank, don't rush today. I remember I had no idea how fast the day was about to move. I walked into my chambers and I smelled the coffee Christina brought me that morning. I always say Christina knows exactly how I like it, and I mean that. I can hear her voice in my head even now, cheerful and steady, like the day can't knock her off balance. I can still see her standing there with the cup, and I can still feel that quiet comfort that comes from someone doing their job with care. I said to Christina, I'm going to need that coffee today. And I remember I tried to smile as I said it. I could tell she was already busy because I could see her hands full of folders. I could see that stack of files, and I could feel the weight of them before I even touched one. I sat at my desk, and I went through my calendar like I always do. I read names. I read charges. I read notes. I read the little pieces of people's lives typed into black ink, and I always wonder how many of them slept the night before. I always wonder how many of them prayed on the way in. I always wonder how many of them looked at their children before they left the house and tried not to show fear. It was a Wednesday in March. I got to the courthouse at 8:15 like always, and I remember I had that feeling that something was going to happen. I can't explain it like a science. I can only explain it like experience. I can feel a day that's going to be ordinary, and I can feel a day that's going to leave a mark. I was going through my case files when I heard a small commotion in the hallway outside. I didn't hear shouting, but I heard that quick, nervous energy in voices. I heard footsteps that didn't match the calm pace I'm used to. I felt my attention shift even before I lifted my head. I looked at Christina, and I saw her pause for a moment like she heard it too. I saw her eyebrows lift, and I saw her mouth tighten just slightly. I said to her, I can feel it, Christina, and I remember I tried to keep my voice light, but I couldn't. I walked into my courtroom, and I watched people come in like they always do. I saw the mix of faces I've seen for decades. I saw the people who looked angry. I saw the people who looked ashamed. I saw the people who looked confused. I saw the people who looked like they had already decided I was the enemy before I said a word. I could smell the faint scent of winter coats drying. I could hear the low hum of whispers. I could hear papers rustle like dry leaves. I could feel that tension that always sits in the room like a second ceiling. I took my seat and I looked out over my courtroom like I always do. I always scan the room, and I always let my eyes rest on the people who look most afraid. I always try to make sure they see my face, not just my robe. I always try to make sure they understand I'm a person before I'm a judge. I called the first case, and I handled it like I always do. I listened. I asked questions. I made rulings. I watched people leave relieved or frustrated, and I watched the line move. I always say justice isn't just about one case. I always say justice is also about the way you treat people as you move through them. I remember I looked at the clock at one point, and I realized we were moving quickly. I remember I felt grateful for that because I knew some people had to get to work. I knew some people had kids to pick up. I knew some people were paid by the hour, and I knew every minute mattered. Then I saw him. I called a name from the file, and I watched a man stand up slowly, like he wasn't sure his legs were going to hold him. I watched him take a step forward, and I saw his hands shake as he held his paperwork. I watched his eyes move around the room like he was looking for a way out. I watched him walk in expecting the worst, and I could tell he had already sentenced himself. I could tell he had been carrying fear long before he reached my courtroom. I could tell he had been practicing apologies in his head. I could tell he had been rehearsing how to beg without looking weak. I saw his clothes, and I didn't see luxury. I saw work. I saw a jacket that had seen too many mornings. I saw boots with worn edges. I saw a face that looked older than the birth date in the file. I saw a man whose life had been heavier than he wanted it to be. I said, "Good morning, sir," and I watched him flinch at the sound of my voice. I said, "I'm not here to hurt you," and I saw his eyes blink fast, like he wasn't sure he heard me correctly. I said, "Tell me your name," and I watched him swallow hard. I heard him say, "Miguel Santos, Your Honor," and I heard that slight tremble in the last word. I heard him say, "Your Honor," like it was a cliff edge. I heard him say it like one wrong breath might push him over. I looked down at the file, and I saw the charge. I saw a moving violation, a stop sign violation near a hospital entrance. I saw a small fine attached to it, and I saw that it wasn't the kind of thing that should destroy a person's week. I saw it was one of those cases that people with money treat like a mosquito bite, and I saw it was one of those cases that people without money treat like a hurricane. I said, "Mr. Santos, why didn't you stop?" And I kept my voice calm. I watched him look at his hands instead of my face. I watched him squeeze the paper so tight I thought it might tear. I heard him say, "I thought I did, Your Honor," and I heard him rush the words like he was afraid I'd cut him off. I heard him say, "I was nervous. I was going to the hospital," and I saw his eyes finally lift to mine. I asked him, "Who are you going to see?" And I leaned forward because I wanted him to know I cared. I watched him hesitate like he was embarrassed to bring his personal life into a public room. I watched him take a breath that sounded like it scraped his throat. I heard him say, "I was going to see my wife," and I heard him add, "She's a nurse there." I heard him say it with pride and pain mixed together. I heard him say it like her job was the best thing in his world and the hardest thing too. I said, "I want you to tell me the whole truth," and I kept my eyes on his. I said, "I don't need a perfect story, I need a real one." And I felt the room quiet down. I could feel people listening because I could feel people recognizing the tone. I could feel that shift when a courtroom stops being a machine and starts being human. I heard Miguel say, "I was bringing her lunch, Your Honor," and I heard him add, "She didn't have time to eat." I heard him say, "I was running late from my job," and I heard him say, "I saw the sign and I panicked." I heard him say, "I thought if I stopped all the way, the cars behind me would hit me." And I heard him admit, "I made a bad choice." I watched his eyes get wet, and I saw him fight it. I saw him bite his lip, and I saw him shake his head like he hated himself for showing emotion. I saw a man trying to be strong and failing, and I saw a man being strong anyway by standing there. I said, "Mr. Santos, do you have any prior issues?" And I looked at the file again. I said it because I wanted to give him a fair reading. I said it because I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing a pattern. I saw the record was clean, and I felt my chest loosen a little. I saw that he wasn't a reckless person who didn't care. I saw that he was a man who had one bad moment at the wrong place. I asked him, "Why are you so afraid today?" And I knew the fine was small, but I could see terror on him like it was a felony. I watched him rub his palms on his pants like he was trying to wipe off shame. I heard him say, "I can't afford it, Your Honor." And I heard him say it like a confession. I heard him say, "I'm behind on rent." And I heard him say, "My daughter needs braces." I heard him say, "My wife works nights." And I heard him say, "I'm trying. I'm really trying." I felt something in me soften, and I had to pause. I had to pause because I've seen men like Miguel my whole life. I've seen them in my neighborhood. I've seen them at construction sites. I've seen them at diners at 5 a.m. with coffee in one hand and exhaustion in the other. I thought about my father, and I remembered how he looked when bills came in the mail. I remembered the way his jaw tightened. I remembered the way he would pretend everything was fine. And I remembered the way my mother would see right through him. I looked at Miguel and I said, "Mr. Santos, I'm going to ask you something simple." I said, "Do you respect the law?" And I watched him nod quickly. I said, "Do you respect that stop sign?" And I watched him nod again, but slower this time. I heard him say, "Yes, Your Honor." And I heard him add, "I was wrong." I heard him say, "I'm sorry." And I heard his voice crack. I said to him, "I believe you." And I watched him blink like he wasn't expecting that. I said, "I believe you're a good man who had a bad moment." And I felt the room breathe. I said, "I'm not going to punish you like you're a criminal." And I watched his shoulders drop. I asked him, "Is your wife working today?" And I saw him glance toward the gallery. I saw him look back at me and hesitate. I saw him swallow again. I heard him say, "She's here, Your Honor," and I watched him gesture behind him. I turned my eyes and I saw her. I saw Mrs. Santos sitting quietly, and I saw her hands folded like she was praying. I saw scrubs under her coat, and I saw tiredness that only caregivers carry. I saw her eyes fixed on her husband like he was her whole world. I saw love in a room that usually holds fear. I looked at her and I said, "Ma'am, are you a nurse?" And I watched her straighten. I heard her say, "Yes, Your Honor." And I heard that proud professionalism in her voice, even though she looked exhausted. I said, "I want you to know I respect what you do," and I meant it. I said, "I want you to know the world runs because people like you show up." And I watched her eyes fill. I looked back at Miguel and I said, "Mr. Santos, I'm going to do something today." I said, "I'm going to dismiss this charge." And I heard a little gasp from somewhere in the room. I said, "But I'm going to ask you to promise me something." And I watched him lean forward like he was hanging on every word. I said, "I want you to promise me You'll stop at every stop sign like your child is crossing it. I said, I want you to promise me you'll treat every rule like it matters. And I watched him nod again and again. I said, and I want you to go home tonight and hold your wife and your daughter and be grateful. And I felt my own throat tighten. I heard Miguel say, "Thank you, Your Honor." And I heard him say it like he had been rescued. I watched him turn toward his wife, and I watched her cover her mouth with her hand. I watched tears slip down her face, and I watched her try to hide them, but I watched them win anyway. I said, "Case dismissed," and I set my gavel down gently. I set it down gently because I never forget that a gavel can sound like a door slamming. I wanted it to sound like a door opening. Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever met someone who thinks rules don't apply to them? Someone who believes money solves everything? Leave me a comment because I actually read them. And if you're enjoying this story, hit that like button for me. I watched Miguel step away, and I watched him walk like a man whose lungs finally filled with air. I watched Mrs. Santos wipe her face, and I watched her whisper something to him that I couldn't hear. I didn't need to hear it because I could read it in their faces. I could read relief. I could read gratitude. I could read the kind of love that gets forged in hard times. I told myself, "Frank, that's why you do this." And I felt my heart steady. I told myself, "Frank, that's why your father worked those hours." And I felt that old pride. I told myself, "Frank, you can't fix the whole world, but you can fix the small corner in front of you." And I believed it. I thought the day might settle back into normal after that. I thought I had gotten my moment of humanity, and I thought we would move on. I thought the line would keep moving, and my coffee would get cold, and I'd go home and tell my wife about a good ruling. I was wrong. I heard it before I saw it. I heard a laugh, and I heard it echo across my courtroom in a way that didn't match anything else. I heard it come from the back, and I heard it cut through the softness that had just settled in the room. I heard it like someone had flicked a switch from compassion to contempt. I looked up, and I searched the gallery with my eyes. I watched people sit still, and I watched them pretend they didn't hear it. I watched a few heads turn, and I watched people exchange that look that says, "Who does that here?" I saw her for the first time, and I felt my stomach sink. I saw a woman sitting like she owned the bench I was sitting on. I saw her legs crossed like she was waiting for a table at a restaurant. I saw her phone in her hand, and I saw her thumbs moving like my courtroom was just background noise to her day. I watched her lift her head, and I watched her smile like she was amused by the suffering in the room. I watched her eyes move toward Mrs. Santos, and I watched her roll her eyes. I watched that small gesture, and I felt something in me tighten because I knew exactly what it meant. I told myself, "Frank, stay calm," and I kept my face neutral. I told myself, "Frank, don't let pride take the wheel," and I breathed slowly. I told myself, "Frank, your job is to teach sometimes, not just punish," and I tried to believe it. I handled a few more cases, and I kept glancing up because I couldn't shake the feeling that she was a storm sitting in my gallery. I kept hearing little sounds from her, little sighs, little scoffs. I kept feeling her impatience in the air. At 10:30, Christina called her case, and I looked down at the file. I saw the name, and I felt the weight of it, like a warning. I saw Montgomery printed cleanly, and I saw the address that told me money lived there. I saw a list of violations, and I saw they weren't just minor mistakes. I said, "Mrs. Montgomery, come forward." And I watched her stand slowly, like she was doing me a favor. I watched her walk to the front, like she was on a runway. I watched her purse swing at her side, and I watched her hold her phone like it was part of her hand. I saw her clothes, and I saw expensive fabric. I saw a coat that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent. I saw jewelry that caught the light when she moved. I saw confidence that wasn't earned. I saw entitlement that was worn like perfume. I said good morning, and I watched her glance at me like she was checking a clock. I heard her say, "Morning," and I heard no respect in it. I heard her say it like she was speaking to a cashier. I said, "Mrs. Montgomery, you're charged with speeding in a school zone, failure to obey a traffic control device, and operating a vehicle with a suspended registration." And I watched her blink like she couldn't believe her name was attached to such ordinary consequences. I said, "Do you understand these charges?" And I watched her shrug. I heard her say, "I guess," and I heard her add, "This is ridiculous." I heard her say, "I didn't see the sign," and I heard her say, "Everybody speeds there." I heard her say it like rules were optional suggestions. I felt my blood pressure rising. I'm not going to lie. I felt it rise because I had just watched a working family tremble over a stop sign, and I was now watching a wealthy woman yawn at a school zone. I felt it rise because I always think about the kids. I always think about the parents who trust that sign to mean something. I said to her, "Mrs. Montgomery, I want you to listen carefully." I said, "This is a court of law, not a shopping mall." And I leaned forward so she could see I was serious. I said, "When you speed in a school zone, you put children at risk." And I watched her roll her eyes again. I heard her say, "No child was hurt." And I heard her say it like that was the only standard that mattered. I heard her say, "I'm very busy." And I heard her say, "I don't have time for this." I took a deep breath and I counted to 10 in my head. I did that because I've learned that anger makes you sloppy. I did that because I've learned that a judge has to be the calmest person in the room. I did that because I've learned that if I lose control, the room loses faith. I asked her, "Do you think your time is more valuable than everyone else's time?" And I kept my voice even. I watched her tilt her chin up slightly, and I watched her smirk. I heard her say, "I'm sure it is," and I heard a few murmurs ripple through the courtroom. I heard her say, "Look, what's the fine?" And I heard her say, "I'll pay it. Can we move on?" I said, "Mrs. Montgomery, I'm going to tell you something I've learned in 40 years. I said, the law doesn't care about your bank account. It cares about your actions." And I watched her stare at me like I had insulted her. I said, "You don't get to buy your way out of accountability." And I watched her laugh. I heard her laugh clearly, and I couldn't believe it. I heard that laugh ring out, and I felt the room stiffen. I heard her laugh like I was performing a comedy routine for her. I said, "Mrs. Montgomery, you're laughing in my courtroom." And I let the words sit. I said, "You're laughing while we talk about children's safety." and I watched her flick her hair back. I said, "Do you understand how that looks?" And I watched her shrug again. I heard her say, "Your Honor, I spend more on shoes than this fine." And I heard Christina behind me let out a quiet breath. I saw my clerk, Christina, close her eyes and shake her head, and I knew she was thinking what I was thinking. I knew she was thinking about the people who come in begging for time to pay $20. I removed my glasses and rubbed my eyes, and I did it slowly so I wouldn't say something sharp. I told myself, "Frank, don't humiliate her just because you can." I told myself, "Frank, teach her something." And I tried to find the right words. I said to her, "Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy character, and it definitely can't buy your way above the law." And I watched her lips tighten. I said, "In my courtroom, a nurse and a millionaire stand on exactly the same ground, and that's how it should be." And I felt a quiet wave of approval in the room. I looked at the file again, and I noticed something that didn't fit. I saw a note about outstanding administrative issues tied to the registration. I saw a reference number that looked more serious than a traffic case. I felt my gut tell me to pay attention. I said to Christina, "I want you to check something for me," and I kept my voice low. I watched Christina nod, and I watched her step away with purpose. I didn't know what she would find, but I knew my instincts weren't usually wrong. I looked back at Mrs. Montgomery, and I said, "Do you have a lawyer with you today?" I watched her glance back toward the gallery like she expected someone to appear. I heard her say no, and I heard her say, "I don't need one." I said, "You might," and I heard my own voice drop. I said, "Because you're not taking this seriously," and I watched her scoff. I said, "And I want you to understand something," and I leaned forward again. I said, "Respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn." And I felt my father's words in my mouth as I spoke. I heard her say, "Are we done yet?" And I felt the frustration hit me like heat. I had to take another deep breath, and I felt it fill my chest slowly. I reminded myself that this job isn't about me. I reminded myself that this job is about the public's faith. I'm going to be honest with you. At this point, I was struggling to keep my composure. If you've ever felt that frustration watching someone disrespect something important, you know what I'm talking about. Hit that like button if you're still with me. And make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next, I never saw coming in my entire career. I watched Christina return with a look I didn't like. I watched her walk quickly, and I watched her lean toward me. I watched her mouth form words without sound for a second, because she didn't want the whole room to hear yet. I heard her whisper, "Your Honor, there's someone here asking to speak." And I felt my stomach tighten again. I asked her, "Who?" And I watched her glance toward the gallery. That's when I noticed a man stand up in the back. I saw him rise with a calm that didn't match the rest of the room. I saw him straighten his jacket like he knew exactly where he was and exactly what he was about to do. I saw him take out a badge, and I saw the bailiff's posture change instantly. I said, "Sir, identify yourself," and I kept my voice steady. I watched him step forward just enough to be seen clearly. I watched him hold the badge up, and I watched the light catch it. I heard him say, "Your Honor, my name is Daniel Rourke." And I heard him continue, "I'm an assistant United States attorney." I felt the room shift like the air got heavier. I felt people sit up straighter. I felt whispers die out. I looked at Christina, and I saw her already holding a sealed envelope. I saw that envelope in her hand, and I felt my pulse quicken. I saw the seal, and I knew this wasn't about a speeding ticket anymore. I said, "Mr. Rourke, what is this about?" And I felt my voice deepen. I watched him look toward Mrs. Montgomery, and I watched her face stay smug for one extra second. I watched her not understand that the ground was about to move under her. I heard him say, "Your Honor, I'm here because the defendant before you is the subject of a federal investigation." And I heard a ripple of shock. I heard him say, "And we have a federal warrant we need to execute today." And I felt time slow down. I took the envelope from Christina, and I felt the thickness of it. I could feel papers inside, and I could feel the weight of the moment. I broke the seal carefully, and I opened it right there on the bench. I read what was inside, and I couldn't believe my eyes. I've seen warrants before, and I've seen serious charges, and I've seen people crumble. But I had never seen something like this walk into my courtroom disguised as a traffic matter. I had never seen arrogance so perfectly timed with consequences. I read the name again, and I read the federal statutes listed. I read words like fraud, conspiracy, wire transfers, and obstruction. I read about shell companies and false invoices. I read about money routed through charities that weren't really charities. I read about millions of dollars siphoned away while she sat in my courtroom acting like a school zone was beneath her. I lifted my eyes and I looked at Mr. Rourke. I said, "Are you telling me this is the same Mrs. Montgomery standing here?" And I heard my own disbelief. I watched him nod once, firm. I heard him say, "Yes, Your Honor." And I heard him add, "We've been building this case for over a year." I heard him say, "We believe she used her position to steal from investors and from a medical foundation." And I felt my stomach turn. I heard him say, "We have reason to believe she falsified records and threatened witnesses." And I felt my skin prickle. Before I tell you what those charges were, let me ask you this. Do you think wealth should protect someone from consequences? Should money put you above the law? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you believe everyone should be equal under the law like I do, hit that subscribe button. I watched Mrs. Montgomery's face as the words landed. I watched that smugness try to hold on. I watched it crack at the edges. I watched her eyes flick to the door like she could simply walk out. I watched her swallow, and I watched her throat move like she was trying to push fear back down. I said her name slowly, Mrs. Montgomery, and I kept my voice controlled. I said, 2 hours ago you were laughing, and I watched her blink fast. I said, 2 hours ago you were telling me about shoes, and I watched her lips part slightly. I watched the color drain from her face. I've seen it before, but I had rarely seen it happen so quickly. I watched her skin go pale, like someone had turned down a dimmer switch. I watched her hands start shaking, and I noticed those same hands that had been so casual with her phone before. I heard her whisper, "This is a mistake," and I heard her voice change. I heard her try to sound firm, but I heard it fail. I heard fear in it, real fear, the kind that doesn't care about designer labels. I looked at her and I said, "Mrs. Montgomery, I'm going to tell you something my father taught me." And I felt my father's voice in my head. He said, "Respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn." And I let it hang in the air. I said, "And you walked in here demanding respect without showing any." And I watched her eyes shine with panic. I heard her say, "Your Honor, please." And I heard the word please sound unfamiliar coming from her mouth. I heard her say, "I can explain." And I watched her look around like she expected someone to rescue her. I said, "You can explain to the federal court." And I felt the room freeze. I said, "Because my courtroom isn't a shield." And I said, "And my robe isn't something you hide behind." I watched Mr. Rourke step slightly to the side, and I watched two men in plain clothes enter. I saw their posture, and I knew exactly who they were. I could feel the tension in the room shift again, sharper this time. I could feel people holding their breath. I watched as the federal agents approached. I watched them move with a calm that told me they had done this many times. I watched them stop beside Mrs. Montgomery like gravity had placed them there. I heard one of them say, "Ma'am, please put your hands behind your back." And I heard the courtesy in his tone, even as the moment was brutal. I watched Mrs. Montgomery hesitate, and I watched her look at me like I could stop it. I watched her eyes plead without words. I said nothing for a second, and I let the reality speak. I let the silence do what my words didn't need to do. I watched her shoulders sag, and I watched her hands move behind her back. I heard the handcuffs click, and I'll never forget the sound. I heard it like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence she thought she could keep rewriting. I watched her flinch as a metal closed. I watched her inhale sharply, and I watched her eyes widen like she was finally awake. I watched her designer handbag fall to the floor, and nobody picked it up. I watched it land with a soft thud that felt louder than it should have been. I watched it sit there like a symbol that suddenly meant nothing. I thought about Mrs. Santos, the nurse she had laughed at, and I felt anger and sadness mixed together. I thought about how many nights that nurse had worked. I thought about how many meals she had skipped. I thought about how many people like her get treated like they're invisible. I watched Mrs. Montgomery turn her head toward the gallery, and I watched her try to find an ally. I watched her eyes land on Mrs. Santos for 1 second. I watched Mrs. Santos hold her husband's hand tighter. I watched Mrs. Santos not smile, not celebrate, not gloat. I watched her just look, tired and steady, like she had seen too much to be surprised by human ugliness. I stood up from my bench, and I rarely do that, but I did it because I wanted the room to understand something. I wanted the room to understand that even in the middle of chaos, the courtroom must have order. I wanted the room to understand that justice is not a show, it's a responsibility. I said, "Everyone remain seated," and I kept my voice firm. I said, "Let the agents do their job," and I watched people obey. I said, "This is what accountability looks like," and I felt the weight of those words. You know what keeps me doing this job after 40 years? Moments like these, seeing that the law really does apply to everyone equally. If this story is restoring your faith in justice, show me by hitting that subscribe button and that like button. Share this with someone who needs to see it. I watched the agents guide her toward the door, and I watched her walk differently than she had walked in. I watched her steps get smaller. I watched her posture collapse. I watched her hair fall slightly out of place, and I watched her not fix it. I watched her look back one more time, and I saw humiliation in her eyes. I saw fear in her eyes. I saw disbelief in her eyes. I saw a person meeting consequences for the first time, like it was a foreign language. I sat back down slowly, and I felt the room still vibrating. I felt that electricity of shock. I felt that quiet satisfaction people feel when they see arrogance humbled. I felt that sadness too, because I never enjoy seeing a life fall apart, even when it deserves to. I looked at Christina, and I saw her exhale, like she had been holding her breath for 10 minutes. I said softly, "All right," and I felt my voice sound older than usual. I said, "Let's take the next case," and I watched the machine of the day try to start up again. I finished the morning docket, but I didn't feel like myself. I finished it because that's my job, and I finished it because people were waiting. I finished it because justice for the next person matters too. But I could feel my mind circling back to what I had just witnessed. Later that afternoon, I went back to my chambers, and I felt the quiet hit me like a blanket. I sat down, and I stared at my desk for a moment. I thought about how close that woman came to walking out with nothing but a fine. I thought about how easily money and arrogance can slip through cracks if nobody pays attention. I heard a knock, and I said, "Come in," and I watched Mr. Rourke step inside. I watched him close the door behind him, and I watched him carry that same calm. I could tell he had been holding a lot of heavy information for a long time. I said, "Mr. Rourke, sit," and I pointed to the chair. I watched him sit, and I watched him place a folder on my desk, like it weighed 100 pounds. I said, "Tell me what this really was," and I felt my voice drop again. I heard him say, "Your Honor, it's bigger than most people know," and I watched his eyes stay serious. I heard him say, "She wasn't just careless," and I heard him say, "She was calculated." I heard him say, "She used her reputation, her connections, and her money to build trust." And I heard him say, "And then she used that trust like a tool to take." I asked him, "How much?" and I felt my stomach knot. I watched him open the folder, and I watched him slide papers toward me. I read numbers, and I felt my jaw tighten. I read 7 figures. I read 8 figures. I read amounts that could pay for surgeries, scholarships, housing, hope. I read that the numbers were staggering, millions of dollars, and I felt my heart sink. I said, "I almost just gave her a fine," and I heard my own voice sound like disbelief. I said, "I almost treated her like she was just rude," and I felt a chill. I said, "I almost let arrogance be the worst thing she carried," and I shook my head slowly. I heard Mr. Rourke say, "That's why we were here," and I heard him say, "We needed her to think the world was normal." I heard him say, "We needed her comfortable," and I heard him say, "We needed her in a place where she couldn't bully her way out." I leaned back and I stared at the ceiling for a moment. I thought about how often people like Miguel Santos come in afraid of a small fine. I thought about how rarely people like Mrs. Montgomery come in afraid of anything. I thought about how unfair that is. I thought about how the system can feel like it's designed to press down on the weak and cushion the strong. I told Mr. Rourke, "I'm glad you were there," and I meant it. I told him, "I'm glad you didn't let her hide." And I felt that old belief in the law flare up again. I told him, because if people stop believing the law is equal, the country starts breaking. And I saw him nod. I went home that night, and I felt the weight of the day follow me like a shadow. I walked into my kitchen, and I saw my wife at the table. I saw her look up, and I saw her read me again like a book she had memorized. I sat down, and I said, "I had a day," and I heard her say, "I know." I told her the story, and I watched her face change at the same moments I had felt them. I watched her get soft when I described Miguel. I watched her get angry when I described Mrs. Montgomery. I watched her get quiet when I described the handcuffs. I heard my wife say, "I'm glad you were there," and I felt something in my chest loosen. I heard her say, "You gave that family hope," and I felt my eyes sting. I heard her say, "And you reminded that other woman that she's not above anything," and I nodded slowly. I went to bed that night, and I stared at the ceiling for a long time. I thought about my grandson, because my grandson turned 12 last week, and watching him grow up reminds me why this work matters. I thought about what kind of world I want him to inherit. I thought about what kind of world he'll believe in if he sees the rich escape and the poor suffer. I told myself, "Frank, keep doing the job," and I finally fell asleep. 2 months later, I received a letter. I walked into my chambers one morning, and I saw it on my desk. I saw the return address, and I felt my stomach tighten again. I saw the name, and I felt that day rush back into me like cold water. I almost didn't open it. I almost told Christina to file it away. I almost told myself I didn't need to hear from her. But I felt something in me pause, and I felt that old belief that people are complicated. I opened it, and I unfolded the paper slowly. I could smell that faint scent of institutional air on it, and I could almost feel the fluorescent lights that had been shining over her as she wrote. She wrote, and I'm reading this directly, "Your Honor, I hated you in that moment." I read that line, and I felt my eyebrows lift. I read the next line, and I felt my throat tighten. I read, "I hated you because you were the first person who didn't flinch when I tried to act important." I read, "I hated you because you looked at me like you could see the truth." I read, "I hated you because you didn't need me." I kept reading, and I felt something change inside me. I read, "I thought money meant safety," and I read, "I thought it meant I could always fix things." I read, "I thought consequences were for other people," and I felt that line hit hard because I've heard it without words 1,000 times. I read, "When the cuffs closed, I heard a sound I will never forget," and I remembered that same click. I read, "I realized I had built my life on fear of being ordinary," and I felt my chest tighten. I read, "And I realized I became cruel because I thought cruelty made me strong," and I had to pause. I sat there holding that letter, and I thought about whether people can change. I thought about my father's words again. I thought about how he used to tell me that a person can be redeemed, but only if they face themselves. I thought about how some people never face themselves until they're forced to. I read the last lines, and I felt my eyes sting. I read, "I don't ask you to forgive me." And I read, "I ask you to remember that arrogance is sometimes just fear in expensive clothing." I read, "And I ask you to keep doing what you did that day." And I read, "Because you did more than punish me, you exposed me." I set the letter down, and I stared at my desk for a long time. I didn't feel sympathy for her crimes, and I didn't feel softness for what she had done. But I felt something else, something human, because I've learned that the point of justice isn't just to break people. I've learned the point is to protect society and to give truth a place to stand. 3 days after the arrest, I saw Mrs. Santos again. I was finishing paperwork, and I heard a knock at my chamber door. I said, "Come in," and I watched her step inside carefully, like she didn't want to take up space. I saw her holding a small envelope, and I saw her eyes already wet. I stood up and I said, "Mrs. Santos," and I felt my voice soften. I saw her hands shake as she held the envelope. I heard her say, "Your Honor, I needed to thank you." And I felt my throat tighten immediately. I told her, "You don't have to thank me," but I said it gently because I knew she needed to say it. I watched her step closer, and I watched her hold the envelope out to Christina first, like she didn't want to break any rules. I heard her say, "I've never seen my husband so scared." And I heard her say, "And I've never seen him so relieved." I heard her say, "You treated him like he mattered." And I felt tears come to my eyes when she said that. I heard her say, "I work with sick people every day." And I heard her say, "And sometimes the hardest sickness is the way people look at you." I heard her say, "That woman looked at me like I was nothing." And I heard her say, "And I didn't say a word." I heard her say, "But I saw you see it." And I felt my chest tighten. I said to her, "I did see it, and I meant it." I said, "And I want you to know that you're not invisible in my courtroom." And I watched her nod. I said, "I want you to know your work is honorable." And I watched her press her lips together as she tried not to cry. I watched her take a breath, and I heard her say, "Your Honor, my daughter wrote you something." And I saw her pull out a small folded paper. I saw a child's handwriting, uneven and earnest. I felt my heart squeeze before I even read it. I read it quietly at first, and I felt my eyes blur. I read, "Dear Judge, thank you for helping my dad." And I felt my throat tighten. I read, "My mom says you are fair." And I felt that word fair hit me harder than any compliment. I read, "I want to be a doctor one day." And I felt my heart jump like hope had just walked into my chambers. I looked up at Mrs. Santos and I said, "Tell her I believe she can." And I meant it with everything in me. I said, "Tell her she can be anything." And I felt my voice shake a little. I said, "Tell her I'm proud of her dream." And I watched Mrs. Santos smile through tears. A year later, I learned something that brought the story full circle in a way I still can't fully explain. I heard through proper channels that recovered money from that federal case helped fund community restitution. I heard that part of it went toward a scholarship program for kids who wanted to go into health care. I heard that it was meant to honor the people who actually keep society alive. The nurses, the aides, the technicians, the ones who don't get applause. I sat in my chambers when I heard the next part, and I felt my eyes sting again. I heard that the first scholarship recipient was Mrs. Santos's daughter. I heard that the little girl who wrote me that letter was now holding a future in her hands, funded by money that had been stolen from Hope and then returned to it. I sat there and I whispered to myself, "This is why it matters." And I felt that old belief in justice settle back into my bones. I thought about Miguel walking in expecting the worst. I thought about how close he came to losing faith. I thought about how one morning could have pushed him into bitterness, and I thought about how instead it pushed him into gratitude. I think about that day often, and I always feel it like a lesson I didn't know I still needed. I think about what it taught me about arrogance, and I think about what it taught me about fear. I think about how some people hide fear behind silence, and I think about how some people hide fear behind diamonds. I think about my father again, and I remember how he came to this country with nothing. I remember how he taught me that dignity isn't given by money. I remember how he taught me that dignity is earned by how you treat people who can't help you. After 40 years, I still believe the law is the great equalizer when we do it right. I still believe my courtroom can be a place where a rich person can't bully their way out, and a poor person doesn't have to beg to be seen. I still believe fairness is not weakness. I still believe compassion is not softness. I still believe accountability is love for the community, not hatred for the defendant. I looked at that letter from prison again days later, and I thought about the line she wrote about arrogance being fear in expensive clothing. I didn't excuse her. I didn't forget what she did. But I understood something important, and I want you to understand it too. I understood that money can buy comfort, and money can buy distance, and money can buy silence from people who want something from you. But I understood that money can't buy integrity. I understood it can't buy respect. I understood it can't buy the ability to sleep peacefully when your own conscience finally speaks. I've learned one thing in 40 years, and I've learned it again and again until it feels carved into me. I've learned that the law doesn't care about your excuses, and it doesn't care about your designer bag. I've learned it cares about choices. I've learned it cares about harm. I've learned it cares about the people who have to live with the aftermath. I told myself that day, "Frank, you were put on that bench to make sure the ground is level," and I still believe it. I told myself, "Frank, don't ever let cynicism win," and I still fight that fight. I told myself, "Frank, keep your heart open, but keep your eyes open too," and I still try. So let me ask you this. Do you think I was too harsh on her, or not harsh enough? I'm genuinely curious what you think. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have shown mercy or delivered justice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. If this story meant something to you, if you believe in equal justice like I do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Someone who believes that character matters more than cash. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another incredible story from my courtroom that you won't believe. I'll see you tomorrow with another lesson about justice, respect, and what really matters in this life. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us, rich or poor, powerful or powerless. That's what makes this country work. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you, and remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.